O'Reilly. You need parts? O'Reilly Auto Parts has parts. Need them fast? We've got fast. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Product availability. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today. You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins.
Oh, hey, everybody. Hey, I should stop briefly, Phil, and explain something. Would you give me a minute to explain something important?
Please.
You're going to be hearing advertisements on the show here coming up, and I feel like I should explain them. We're working with the new company, and the way this works for advertising is they drop in, we record ads, and they drop them in parts of the show. And I just want you to know that we're doing our best to make all that work and make it a seamless process. But we got to make money, right, Phil?
Yeah, we got to keep the lights on in your nursery, Ben.
Somebody's got to pay Phil's exorbitant salary. I mean, he makes tens of thousands of dollars a show. Worth every penny. And, every time I say right, Phil, he says right in a way that no one else could.
Yep.
So just so you know, new things happening, very good things for our show. I might finally get the Cash App to advertise. I might finally get ExpressVPN to advertise. All these great advertisers that if they're on your show, you've made it, I feel. I don't know if you agree with that, Phil, but that's my goal. The other goal is to get White Claw as a title sponsor of the show. And if we've done those things, I may just end it right there. I'm not sure. But I'm excited about our new advertising partners coming up. So enjoy that. That was a little public service announcement. But to today's episode, it's a fantastic one. You're going to love it. You agree, Phil?
Yes. I mean, honestly, I don't like to play favorites, but this is a good one.
One of my favorites. We answer a few emails. Phil has never took a shit in the woods. We meet Dolly Broadway, the crazy TikTok lady, and learn about Joshua's perspective of his COVID-19 experience, THC listener. But all of that is only a footnote to Robert C. Jones, the return of Robert C. Jones, our friend, the vegan, the philosophy professor out of California. He's currently in Hollywood. He's got a lot of cool stories for us. We talk about bargaining and consumption, what death really means, what suffering really means, and start to define how we think about veganism versus hunting and consuming of meat. I think it's a very important conversation. In the preamble, we talk about shit and White Claw. So that's THC for you. Enjoy. Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 122. Is that right, Phil? 122?
That is correct.
Of the Hunting Collective. I, of course, am Ben O'Brien. I'm joined by Philip T. Engineer. Say hello, Philip.
Hello.
And we're chugging along into April. We're going to take a break from turkeys this week for a very important public service announcement. We have the return of Dr. Robert C. Jones. Are you excited, Phil?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of the interview, and I should say that the listeners should be excited as well.
I said at the very tail end of the interview, and I do feel like this is true, that Robert just being, I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent, also just incredibly nice person. And so I think he brings out the best in me, and maybe vice versa, I don't know. But he definitely brings out the best in me in terms of like how I think about and articulate some of the things that we've covered over the couple 122 episodes of this show. So you're really going to like it. We're not going to do too many things. We're just going to kind of let that interview be what it is for this episode. But we got some listener emails, some things to get to before we get to Robert. Now, Phil, in true THC fashion, we're going to do some silly shit. We're going to talk about crapping in the woods. We're going to talk about White Claw, and then we're going to get into a very serious intellectual discussion. Are you ready?
I mean, it sounds like standard THC. So
Standard just complete ridiculousness that makes no
shit
sense.
and White Claw.
Shit and White Claw.
And then serious discussion.
And then serious discussion. That is how I built my life. The first thing, I got an email from, the guy's name is Robert Sent, I believe. I'll have to pull up my email and make sure I got all your names right, because I clearly do. Now I'm just going to be stalling for a moment till I get this up. Robert Sents, S-E-N-T-S, said, and a lot of you sent me this. There's something called TikTok. Are you familiar with TikTok, Phil?
Yes, I am. Our very own Maggie Smith did one this past week. I don't know if you've seen it. It's Tiger King themed.
I've seen it. It is fantastic. Where do I send people to watch that? The Lone Loon?
Yeah, her Instagram. I think her stories might have disappeared by now. I think it's gone. It's lost to the sands of time. But
maybe on TikTok. Maybe
yes,
it's on
TikTok. Short. They're kind of like short Instagram, short videos that usually involve dancing or lip syncing. That's usually the theme. But there are other things as well.
Are you on TikTok, Phil?
I am not. No, I'm not that hip.
You're a gamer. I thought all gamers were into the what's cool on the internet.
Appreciate it, man, but no, I'm not. I haven't caught up that far.
I was trying to imbibe some good qualities of gamers. But a lot of people, I would say like a dozen people, sent me the same link to this White Claw video from, and it is very explicit. But it's an old lady, so I mean, I feel like old lady cursing is not as impactful as if, say, you or I were to say foul things. This lady's name is Dolly Broadway, and Phil, she's got a 1.2 million followers on TikTok. I don't know what to say about that.
Well, I mean, she's a personality, that's for sure. I'm when I join TikTok, I will be one of her followers for sure.
Robert said, my wife sent this video to me a few weeks back, and I thought of you guys instantly. I'm catching up on backlog of podcasts, and I had to send you this link. Enjoy. All right, so here we go. It's like an older lady. How would you describe her, Phil? I'll let you go ahead and do that, in case I offend anybody.
Short, bright red hair, glasses. The funniest thing about this video to me is that she's just like behind like a picnic table with a really cheap like tablecloth over it and a beige wall behind her. She could have gone more on production design, but
that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's just called White Clawantine. It says, "Try my new drink, a White Clawantine."
Hi, I'm Dolly. Today I'm going to teach you how to make a White Clawantine. First, you put 2 White Claws mango.
White Claws mango, plural.
It tastes like shit. Then you put a splash of orange juice.
She has a giant jug of orange juice. She's picking it up and pouring it all over the table.
She puts like nothing in there.
Yeah. She puts some
virus and its mother. Or you use a half a cap of Miralax.
Miralax.
Your nose won't go to shit. You all have that toilet paper in mind to put it to good juice. You put ice in it, and then you blend it.
There's no ice in there.
Oh, shit, I forgot to put the lid on it. Look.
That's it. She doesn't put ice in it.
No,
she has it looks like water at the end. It's not even...
Yeah, well, one of my favorite things besides White Claws mango, which is just incredible.
Attorneys, what are you saying? Attorneys General.
Yeah. When you're referring to a plural attorney general, it's attorneys general. That's what it reminded me of. Also, she says a splash of orange juice. She puts like no orange juice in. And she's like, oh, I put in too much.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, at the end she says, put some ice in it. There's clearly no ice in there. And it looks like just water and White Claw maybe. And it's a Miralax because she says, all you have the toilet paper, you might as well use it. God bless you, Dolly Broadway. God bless you from us here at THC. So if you want to find Dolly Broadway, you first have to know what TikTok is. And then you have to find her on there. And here's one where she's dressed up like Snow White. She's holding a White Claw, and on the other hand, she's holding a Buzz Lightyear doll. There's another one where she's dressed like a princess, and there's one where she has 2 giant Easter eggs. So I don't even know. I'll probably spend a good hour watching all these, Phil, after this. She's quite popular. So shout out to, maybe have her on the podcast and give her own segment, Dolly Broadway. TikTok.
Oh, she doesn't need our publicity. She's way more famous than you.
That's true. So I'm probably gonna have to pay for that.
Yeah,
I would think. All right. Well, we got a lot to get to. I just, generally would apologize to everyone who is here for the intellectual conversation, because now we're going to move on to pooping. You ready for that, Phil?
Oh yeah, this is a horrifying story.
Go ahead and read that out. Read that for us, buddy.
Sure. Okay. So this comes from K Camp. Let's see. Keith. Hello, Ben and Phil the engineer. So here I am, sitting alone with my back against a pine, turkey hunting in Colorado. Shooting light is now gleaming, and I am hoping that the turkey I hear gobbling wants to come my way. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure appears to the right. It is a camo-dressed person and 2 dogs. He walks in front of me at a hurried pace and stops at 20 yards away. I wave my hand to catch his attention and let off a deep, "Hey!" He does not hear or see me. Instead, he whips his pants down and proceeds to take a nice steamer right in front of me. What would you do? When do I let him know my presence? Of course, I didn't watch after I figured out what was going on. I went the I'll stay hidden route, and he will never know I was here. However, when he got up to walk away, his dog came over to the fully camouflaged me and began growling. I was caught. We both had a good laugh, and he apologized. Coffee had finally kicked in for his bowels. I have not found another hunter that has had this happen to him or her, and I did not bag a turkey that day, but did find a little mule deer shed. Congratulations. That's from Keith.
Congratulations, Keith. Now, Keith, I had this happen to me, and we talked about it on the quarantine cast with Miles Nolte. He was a coworker of mine, and so this happened. We told the story where we were elk hunting together, and I split off with Joe Farinato, Jamie, and Sam Lungert and Miles Nolte went another direction, and we were going to kind of wrap around these 2 ridges and then meet up at some point if we hadn't seen any elk. Well, we were coming back down this ridge toward where they were, and we came upon this man in First Light taking a shit. And we were 20 yards maybe behind him. He didn't see us, and I thought for sure at some point he would turn around, but he never did. So we just had to stand there uncomfortably at about 20 yards while he finished up. And it took a long time, as you would hear if you go back to that episode, because we had eaten some habanero wild turkey the night before. And so this has happened to me. And it is very uncomfortable, and you have to look away, but then you have to keep checking back to see what's going on. You can't just look away forever. You got to check back to see if he's done, and then check back again. So it's a delicate dance. But you're not alone, Keith. You're not alone. And I don't think, Phil, you don't have any similar stories?
I'm trying to think. No. I mean, no, pooping in the woods.
That was a quick no. I'm trying to think. No.
No, I'm trying to think if I've ever even done that.
Pooped in the woods?
Nope.
What?
Nope. I mean, I've been camping like a lot, but it's never been. Maybe my body naturally shuts down my bowels because I don't want to poop in the woods for a few days.
Whoa! I like where this is going.
Oh, I don't.
We're gonna peel the onions back. That is the onion layers. That is Phil now. Phil, you have a nervous bowels in the woods?
I'm not. It's not nervous. I think it's just a subconscious thing. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I've never pooped in the woods.
Wow,
I never have.
This weekend, your assignment is to just go poop in the woods, man. It's just
okay.
You've never experienced it. It's so freeing. I would find you got to find like a log to sit on or a tree to lean up against. Make sure it's comfortable. make sure you have your whatever you're going to wipe with in your hand. That way there's no kind of like movement afterwards. It's a very efficient affair.
That's a good tip.
There's actually, our buddy Mark Kenyon wrote How to Crap in the Woods, an article that's on themeateater.com right now. So we'll leave that at that, but Phil, we'll look forward to next episode, your report on your first time.
Okay. I'm looking forward to it too. I got a lot of crap for saying 2.5 for my turkey excitement the other week, but crapping in the woods, I think I'm at a solid 8.
Oh, man.
So wait, hold on. It was a 2.5 level of disappointment, but I'm at an 8 for excitement.
I like it.
For pooping in the woods, yeah.
Makes sense, even though it doesn't make sense. All right, we got a couple of sheltered perspectives here, even though that's not the official title of the segment. A lot of you sent these in, so thank you so much for sending those in. Next week, we're going to have, I know we promised Eric Hall, but Phil and I want to prepare the proper tribute to our friend Eric Hall. We chatted with him last week and from his home and got to know him a little bit better, but we want to prepare a proper tribute for our friend Eric, so we're going to get him next week. But this week, we have Joshua Butler. Is that how you'd say that, Phil? Beutler? Butler?
I think it might just be Butler.
Why the hell is the E in there, Joshua?
It's that European.
Jesus Christ, man.
European
help me
flavor.
out.
Or Beutler. Might be Beutler.
I can't. Why? Is there any Smiths out there listening that have emails? Lord heaven. Joshua says, being an essential worker, a Navy veteran with friends on the quarantined aircraft carrier, and someone who routinely deals with handling hazardous materials, I have a unique perspective on the current pandemic and proper use of PPE. I'm a radiation safety technician at our power plant located on the edge of the New England COVID-19 quote-unquote bubble. We have been deemed essential in order to keep power flowing to the region. Some of my job responsibilities is to ensure the radiological safety of the public, workers, and environment. Working presents many challenges. We have had to fundamentally change the way we perform our jobs. Evolutions that were simple a month ago have become incredibly difficult. We've had to incorporate social distancing and physical barriers such as plexiglass into as many applications as possible to limit the spread of the disease. Even with all the protective measures, there's still a risk of transmission. We are strictly enforcing a quarantine of all personnel who become sick or who have been potentially exposed. This leaves the rest of our staff working extra to ensure minimum staffing to make sure the safe operation is met. And here's where you learn a little bit about Joshua and where it would get scary for me. As he says, as the father of 3 young daughters, the threat of bringing home the virus is always at the back of my mind. I spent 10 years in the military. My only fear then was the potential of myself not returning from deployment. This is a new perspective for me because I have not had to fear for my loved one's safety. My family is healthy and not in the risk group, but the thought is always there. As someone who regularly deals with hazardous materials, it is painful to watch people improperly using PPE. A message I would really like to get out there would be to research their protective equipment to make sure you're not causing more harm than good with it. And then he goes on to say, hope this email finds us well, and thank you for the great content to take all our minds off the current state of the world. Josh. So, Josh, thanks for that. Phil, have you been wearing PPE when you go outside?
Well, I've had to do a couple of store runs, try to get stuff delivered when we can, but with produce and groceries, it's a little tough. But when I do, here's the thing. When I read this, it kind of jumped out at me because when he says improperly using PPE, what I've been doing is after I get out of the car, like between my car and whatever store I'm going into, I put on gloves and I pull like a bandana mask type thing over my mouth. It's not like an N95 mask or anything like that. Just some sort of barrier, mostly for other people's protection rather than mine, just so I'm getting less moisture into the air when I'm breathing. But that's pretty much it. And then I heavily sanitize and wash after all my trips and stuff like that. But I've never actually looked up, am I doing this right? Like, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing with these gloves, or how efficient is this mask actually, or anything like that?
Right. Me either. And I think, from Josh's example, obviously he knows things that regular folks don't know. I mean, I've watched some videos and I kind of understand these things, but I'm also the type of person who's very skeptical that it matters at all. But I want to be responsible to the people around me, so I certainly would wear a mask. And I got, if you go back to January when we were recording podcasts about the birth of my son, I got a little preview of this in January. So basically, I've been quarantined for the entire 2020 year when my wife got influenza B right as she was full term with our son. And so I had to wear a mask for a week straight in the hospital so I could be in the room with her. And then we had to sit and kind of be quarantined until she was better and we could have the baby. So I had boxes of masks and got some training from the doctors during that time as to what to do. And they're very much explaining what we've all heard, that it's not necessarily going to protect you from getting sick, but it's certainly, if you're coughing or sick yourself, it can protect the others around you. So that's the way I approach it. But certainly, Josh, write in and let us know. Give us a step-by-step of what you would do. That's not a bad thing for all of us. But thanks, Josh, for doing what you do out there. Stay safe and healthy. Take care of your family. Because I know, Phil, you would probably feel the same. If you get out there in this world and you might get sick, that's fine. That's something you can deal with. But not knowing whether you're going to bring that home to the family, which is all that matters, is a fear that I don't know that I could handle.
Well, I mean, I just, even if it isn't doing a whole lot, I feel like it's not doing any harm. And how hard is it for me to put on some gloves and cover my mouth before I go out to a store? It couldn't be easier. And if there's even a chance that there's one less person that gets, just like, and we're just putting barriers up, and if one less person gets sick, then it was worth it. So it's not a big deal, so I'm just going to continue doing it.
Yep. And if the best quote I've heard about all this, and again, you're not coming to THC for the pandemic response expertise, I hope. Hope you're going elsewhere for that. But the best quote I've heard thus far is that if we do this right, it's going to look like an overreaction. If we do all this right, at the end of all of this COVID-19, we're going to look like we overreacted. And I think that's telling to what Phil says and what everybody feels. It feels silly wearing a mask, but if you can help one person, hopefully that person lives in your home with you, or you help someone else out in your community, that's how you ought to do it. So we will continue reading your emails. I got a bunch of other emails that I want to get to later in the weeks to come. We got a bunch of great guests coming up, but for now, one of my favorite people and one of my favorite conversations is that of Robert C. Jones. If you don't remember Robert, you would go back and listen to our last episode. It was over the summer last year, and actually I remember that being one of the first episodes where we got to know Phil a little bit better. And so here we are. Now Phil, the engineer, is fully bloomed as a part of our team and just a part of our hunting community. He's there. He's getting ready to take his first shit in the woods. And now we're going to get to our friend Robert Jones and a great conversation about, what are the bargains of consumption that we make, and what really is death and suffering in the context of human versus animal interaction. So here he is, my friend Dr. Robert C. Jones. Mr. Robert C. Jones, how are you, sir?
Ben, good to hear from you again. Good to be back.
Yes, it's great to have you back. This is much anticipated, I must say, from a lot of the emails I've gotten since we announced it last week that you were coming back. A lot of people are excited for our conversation.
Well, I'm excited too, and I wanted to say I was looking through my emails in preparation for this. I received exactly 16 emails from your listeners. I wrote all their names down. I don't know if you want me to give shout outs, but what I can say is I was surprised. Every single email I got was supportive. I didn't get any hate mail. So, I mean, not that your listeners would send me hate mail, but having a vegan on a hunting podcast, I was really pleasantly surprised at how much support and how much encouragement I got from the listeners. So thanks to the emails.
Well, I would thank everybody for doing that and reaching out. Certainly, for me, it's nice to just reflect on those moments where you kind of take a little bit of a risk. I don't know if talking to you is not a risk. You're a very reasonable person, and there's nothing that gets me, that scares me or thinks there's any traps involved. But it's nice to do something outside the norm, and almost everybody appreciated your approach and appreciated the conversation. And I think that bodes well for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, nice work. Nice work on your part.
Yeah. So before we get into any of the conversation here, what's going on over there? You were telling me you had to adapt to teaching from home, and you're kind of in. We're not really in a hot spot here in Montana, but I'm sure you got a lot to deal with over there in California. So update us on what's happening in the quarantine.
Well, since the last time we spoke, I was actually working at Cal State Chico, which is about 170 miles north of San Francisco. And then this year I took a job down in LA. And so I'm speaking to you from Hollywood, California. I teach here at California State University, Dominguez Hills this year. And so I moved from Chico, a kind of bucolic little college town. I picked the wrong time to move back into the lair of the virus here. So the good thing is that California was a little bit ahead of things, and it's not like it is over in New York. So, but it's still not super safe. But I do have to say, Ben, I do try to acknowledge a few things. Like one is, I'm really blessed to be able to have, my gig, I'm teaching online. I took all of my courses that were taught in the classroom, moved them online. And so I have the kind of job where I'm, at least as far as I can see, I don't have a threat to my income. So there's a lot of people who are losing their jobs. So I feel really fortunate. I feel fortunate that, I'm not on the front lines delivering food or in the emergency room. So I feel pretty privileged. I'm sitting here in my little apartment and I'm teaching my classes online. And, so I feel like I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of people who have it really much worse than I do. So it's not too bad. I can't complain.
Yeah, that's the same here for us. We've had a lot of, like I told you before we hit record, we did a daily show for 3 weeks, and I think this is our 18th podcast during the quarantine, and I am reaching out and trying to find as many perspectives as I can, because it's such a different thing for everyone. Everybody has a different way of experiencing this, and there's lots of hardship out there, and we always try to acknowledge that. But hey, I'm glad that you're doing okay, and you're still teaching.
Still doing my thing. I'm still corrupting the youth here from California.
You bastard. Do you have any moments during this quarantine that you feel you remember looking back on this years from now? So something weird that happened, or something prophetic that you feel that is worth bringing up?
I feel like basically, okay, so here's the moment I've been thinking about is, I used to think that naively that, there were the government had things set in place. Like, I think about, like, okay, here's my gig. I'm a philosophy professor. I prep all my stuff. I read, I make lecture notes. I go into I do my gig. My gig is not pandemic prevention. And I foolishly assumed that there are people in this country who that's their gig, to make sure that this stuff is in place. And so I had a moment when, a few weeks ago, where I thought, holy hell, like, I'm not a survivalist, but I have a whole new respect for people who saw ahead and thought, like, I gotta have supplies and provisions, because, like a lot of people, I was left, thinking I got to go to the store and stand in line and stuff. So I did have this moment where I guess I felt like things are much more rickety than I imagined. I thought, like I said, naively, I thought that there's people who do this for a living, and now I realize, wow, I really have to be much more self-sufficient than I thought. So of course I started looking at survivalist websites, and I'm like, damn, I'm ready for the next one. I don't know if I make it through this one. So that was my learning experience.
I like the term rickety. I really, that does describe it so well. Is exactly how I feel. Yeah, and I think for me too, just realizing that the structure in which we kind of move in our everyday lives is fragile. Yeah. And we're fragile as well, obviously. I think we don't sit up in the morning and realize either of those things, nor would we want to on a daily basis. But now you have to, and it takes form in a lot of weird ways. I've had some just really weird personal exchanges with people where some people really want to acknowledge you. They want to reach out from 6 feet away at least and say, "Hey, I see you. I'm happy. Hope you're happy." And there's other people that just do not want to look anyone in the eye, don't want to be close to anyone, are just reeling from human contact. I imagine you see a lot of that in Hollywood.
Yeah. In fact, yesterday, today I had a little emergency in the morning with my washing machine. Yesterday, I went to start the car and the battery was dead, of course. And so I got my backpack and I walked. I hadn't really left my house in like 10 days, and I walked down to Hollywood and Vine to the Pep Boys there to get a battery for the car, and it was definitely surreal. Hollywood and Vine is usually packed, and it was empty. But I did see a bunch of people along the way, and I noticed exactly what you're talking about. There were some people, as I was walking, everyone had masks and stuff, but there was this kind of like, for some people, there was this kind of acknowledgement, like we looked at each other and sort of either waved or, made whatever, a little connection, like, hey, we're in this together. And then there was, and I count myself among those people. And then there were the people who, man, they were just walking down the street, didn't acknowledge it, no acknowledgement whatsoever. And I thought, wow, it's kind of a weird, it's like a sociological phenomenon when you're under this kind of pressure. Like, how do you respond? Do you feel like you want to reach out, or do you want to, hide? And so, yeah, it was a weird thing, but fortunately I got home, put the battery in, the car started. So I had, that's part of my like self-sufficiency. I was like, I can't be left without a car. What if there's an earthquake? I'm in LA. What if there's I gotta be able to get out of here. So anyway, there you go. Yeah. More self-sufficiency on my part.
I like it. I like it. Yeah. And for me, I've been really focused on just how people around me react, and examining my own reaction to this whole thing. And even in the conversations we've been having in the last 3 or 4 weeks, trying to make sure, I personally document for everybody listening kind of what I'm going through. Like you said, my experience has been just kind of like, well, I got to stay home more than I would otherwise. And it's, I take care of 2 little kids, but it's not so bad. So I'm glad to hear that, so we can put that part to bed and get on to what I think everybody wants to hear.
Okay.
Is us talk about veganism, animal rights, hunting, and the like.
Yeah.
Have you thought much, our last conversation, we won't rehash, exactly how it went or I know we both think it was productive, and almost every listener that I interacted with back then and to this point, because it's still available for folks to download, and they do, has reacted with positivity and supportive nature. Why do you think that is? Do you think there's something in their approach, or how does that make you feel?
Well, okay, so I did try yesterday. I thought, let me listen to that, because I hadn't listened to the podcast, and I thought, let me kind of familiarize myself with what we talked about just to get it in my head. So I did listen. It's really difficult for me to listen to myself. So I made it about a half an hour in. I was like, I'm sounding kind of foolish. So, but first of all, I do think that, and I'm not just, this is not just false compliments. I do think that your ability as an interviewer, but also your ability to be pretty open-minded and see different points of view. Because, when we first started today, you mentioned something like entrapment or traps. But that was my original reluctance, was like, okay, is this going to be like a hatchet job? Like, I'm going to go onto this podcast and I'm going to get, minced, and then they're going to edit it and make it sound like I'm a lunatic. So I think first of all, a lot of the success, if there, for whatever success there was in our first dialogue, has to do with your intelligence and your experience and your understanding and open-mindedness. So that had a lot to do with it, I think. And secondly, I think that a lot of animal rights people or vegans, rightly or wrongly, have a reputation for maybe intolerance or self-righteousness or holier than thou kinds of things. And that's a position that I actively try to counter in my own life as an animal rights person. So hopefully, part of what I hope was successful about our discussion last time was that I explicitly wanted to come onto your podcast and make the point that there are actually a lot of issues on which people like you and I agree, and our positions, although in some ways might be opposed, in other ways are actually congruent, and there's room for like reasonable disagreement as opposed to, a hunter and a vegan yelling at each other or something like that. And I have heard some other podcasts with other guests. I won't mention them, but I have watched, vegans and hunters, and it's just I can't even last a minute. So,
I can't either.
So I do think that that's part of what I think the success was.
Yeah, like I said, we won't dwell on this too much, but I really do think that there's a version of this where both of these things are made on each side, right? On each pole, if you were to say an animal rights activist or a diehard hunter who doesn't really accept the point of view, they're made to seem like it's not an approachable subject. People are scared of those social landmines that they might step on. They may be, I've experienced more criticism from within the hunting world, not specifically on our conversation, but just in general as my activities as someone who produces media, than I have from the outside world, whether it's, whether you would put anti-hunters or vegans or animal rights activists. So I think there's a lot of fear baked in on both sides. I don't know do you feel that on your side as you try to push for a more reasonable way to talk about veganism and animal rights? Do you feel more heat from within that community than from without?
Well, I certainly feel when I do things like this, I do feel a little nervous sometimes, thinking, is this going to be perceived as me being like a turncoat or abandoning the cause in some way? And there are sections or sectors of the animal rights movement that wouldn't condone me even having this conversation. But I think, so I do feel some pressure. I don't know how much of it is real. It could be imaginary on my part, but I do, when I have told people about our podcast and sent it out to folks and, animal rights people, and I was pleasantly surprised. I didn't get any discouraging commentary. Everyone thought, wow, that was really great. And people thought, like I said, Ben, about you, people were like, because like we've talked about before, there's this caricature of hunters and there's a caricature of vegans. And I think people who I shared the podcast with were pleasantly surprised at encountering someone like you, who, you're not, like you said, even from some hardcore hunters, you might get pushback. So I think that was a positive side to this, was exposing not only me as someone who's engaging with a hunter to animal rights people who I've sent it to, but also your thoughtfulness and intelligence was people like, oh, okay, so it's not like, it's not a bunch of wackos who like to kill things, right? So just like people may have heard, oh, not all vegans are lunatic, right? So hopefully that kind of that disseminated among those people who listen to go, oh, there's something to be said on both of these ends.
Yeah. I really do see this lately as I think about it. I see like this is an active struggle for me personally. I've heard this from a lot of people too, and a lot of people that listen to this show are new to hunting and they're in their 30s or 40s and they're wrestling with some of these, more ethical questions, morality, some of the entanglements of just kind of what is in essence of like a tragedy that you've inflicted on something like that is. That's a big part of it. So I see this as an active struggle for me, but I get so much from hunting that I feel like I would be remiss if I got, remove that from my life, because there is this active struggle within me. And so it's a balance. You feel that about your own consumption and your own feeling about animals? It's like there is some active struggle with you trying to figure out a very complex interaction.
Oh yeah, and this is something that I've come to over years, of first starting out, like many vegans, I imagine, thinking that I sort of found the solution to ending suffering, and thinking that my own personal consumer behavior is in some way going to have this impact, or it separates me, it sort of purifies me in some way, and then that view, I quickly got reality crashed in on that view, and then the more I looked into it, realizing this is a constant struggle, and it's a very complicated situation. It's a very complicated dynamic of consumption, impact, suffering, and the way it all plays out. So yeah, I do feel like, as I mentioned the last time we were together, the last time we talked, I do see veganism and this kind of lifestyle as an aspiration, and everyone has blood on their hands. So for me, it's a question of how can I, within reason, within a reasonable amount, how can I decrease suffering? Here I am in, the most affluent culture probably in the world, and I live in a metropolitan area. I have a decent income, and I have the ability to make choices with my purchases and my lifestyle, and my being an exemplar perhaps to people who are struggling with how to be a vegan. And so all of this is very complex, and these questions of decreasing suffering, you have to look at them in the light of day. You can't think, well, I went to the store and I bought tofu and everything's cool. Every purchase, every interaction I have as a consumer or as a professor, these things have effects. And so to think that I'm in some way outside the circle of suffering, or I've removed myself from that, that's a case. I think if you believe that, it's a kind of a bad faith, it's a bad faith. It's like you have to accept that you're a cause. We're entangled in this web of suffering and killing, and that includes human beings, that includes people from non-affluent nations, that includes animals, that includes the environment, the water. So all that stuff is affected by each one of us, and so it's complicated. And how the way that I choose to address that, or the way you choose to address that, those might take different paths. I think the important thing, though, is to have that kind of epiphany to say, this is really complicated, and to think, for me to think, well, I'm just going to buy tofu and be fine, or for a hunter to think, well, I'm not going to buy any agriculture, big ag products, and I'm just going to live off each one of those are choices that comes with kind of welfare or suffering, a footprint. And the first step is to realize it. And then I think, Ben, you're like this too. It's like being cognizant of the fact, and that let's put it this way. You said something last time, I remember. You said, it's like you and I, we sort of started with the same worldview, and we sort of walked in two different directions, but we both had the kind of philosophy of lowering our impact on the environment and the planet and the animals. And so acknowledging that is really important. And my fear is that, and I don't know if this is just armchair empirical, speculating, but my fear is that a lot of people who are vegans and a lot of people who are hunters don't get to that moment where they're like, wait a second, this is a lot more like, I wish life were as simple as I'll just be a vegan, or I'll just hunt for my food myself. But when in fact it's very complicated, especially when you follow those, when you follow your trail to the ultimate mode or the ultimate point of suffering from your consumption. It's pretty complicated.
Yeah, it is. And that's the one thing that I think about always is it could be a solution. It's a solution to a myriad of problems with kind of the constructs of who we are and how we move through the world. And it's something that starts out as personal, but then if you care enough, you kind of want to share it with other people because it's important to you.
O'Reilly Auto Parts are in the business of keeping your car on the road. O'Reilly Auto Parts offer friendly, helpful service and the parts knowledge you need for all your maintenance and repairs. If you're confused about what part you need, like what wipers are going to be the best, what replacement headlights are going to be the best, go into O'Reilly and talk to the people that work there because they're great and they're super friendly and they'll get you squared away where you walk out knowing you got the right thing. They've got thousands of parts and accessories in stock, either in-store or online, so you never have to worry if you're in a jam. Do you need your windshield wipers replaced? You need a brake light fixed? You need some quick service? They'll help you find the right part or point you to the nearest local repair shop for help. The professional parts people at O'Reilly Auto Parts are your one-stop shop for all things auto do-it-yourself, and you can find what you need in-store or online. Stop by O'Reilly Auto Parts today or visit us at O'ReillyAuto.com/MeatEater. That's O'ReillyAuto.com/MeatEater. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today. You ever get that feeling you're stuck inside staring at screens and a primal urge kicks in? You crave wide open spaces, fresh air, the chance to connect with the land. Well, maybe it's time to find your own piece of the wild, but searching for property can be a maze. That's where Land.com comes in. They got millions of listings across the country, from mountain ranches to hidden fishing holes. Their search tools are like a seasoned guide helping you narrow down what you want. Land.com isn't just about buying and selling. It's about finding a place to hunt, fish, explore, or simply sit by a campfire and listen to the crickets. So head over to Land.com today to turn one day into today, because trust me, there's nothing quite like the feeling of standing on your own piece of earth.
I think the biggest issue right now with me, other than just kind of discussing some of the finer details of the act of killing versus, the act of like the suffering and something that we'll get to, is simply that when you think you have the solution, right? If I'm a hunter and I say, I have the solution, just kill wild animals and everything will be fine. And if a vegan or animal rights person said, just adopt this certain diet, this certain way of moving, and you're absolved, you stop thinking critically about a very important thing. You stop being adaptive in your reasoning, and you stop being flexible and being able to change and grow as your understanding of these interactions changes and grows. And that's frustrating to me. And I think if there's one thing that we could kind of examine here is how to kind of bring out of the shadows the bulk of the people who are just like you and I, who are very passionate about some idea, but at the same time are willing to accept that it's not prescriptive for everyone, or at the same time necessarily only right way to do it. Maybe I am suffering from reading too many social media posts from one or the other, but it just doesn't seem like that group is represented anywhere. Especially within animal rights, I see a lot of, there's a lot of bombastic, like over the top imagery, and a lot of things that are meant to shock people into paying attention, I imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at an organization like PETA people for the ethical treatment of animals, they are, I mean, they're really brilliant at manipulating the media, and you know, being provocative works. I mean, whether or not we like it. So I don't really keep up much on the vegan social media as much as I probably should. But I see, you know, provocative kinds of imagery, and you know, it does work. It does work to have people to kind of like get people's emotions riled up and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't follow it as much as I used to, but I do think that well, let me put it this way: there's a power imbalance, and this is not, and I'm not justifying any kind of misrepresentation. Like, if there are photographs or if the ways that things are presented, imagery that's misrepresentative, you know, I don't endorse that. I do think, though, that there is an extreme power imbalance, right? So we live in a culture that is, you know, some people call it carnonormativity, right? It's like eating meat is just the norm, right? And so I don't know, what percentage of people in the world are vegetarian? 4% or something? In the United States, it's like 2%. So yeah. It's pretty small, right? So, I mean, when you have a small group, a relatively small group of people who have this position that, you know, oh, well, animals are moral, there's moral subjects, and the overwhelming majority of people don't agree with that, or at least in practice they don't agree with it. And you have a country with, you know, 330 million people and 400 million guns. I think I can understand where the kind of like the anger and the moral outrage comes from. It's sort of like you're like a lone wolf saying, and you know, saying, "Hey, pay attention to this issue." No one's really giving a crap about this issue.
Yeah. And I always hear this is one thing that comes up, and I've said this in the past and repeated this over many shows, that I do, if I felt, you know, just removing on my own personal feelings for a moment, if I felt that this, you know, there was mass murder being committed and there was this whole, the relationship between these two things was domineering and humans were abusing en masse animals, as it were, I probably, you know, you would become an activist, because that's one hell of a worldview to take. That's got to be associated with a lot of anger and a lot of, you know, the need to be louder and louder to be heard. And that also, the thing, you know, in talking to Matt, I believe it's Matt Johnson from Direct Action Everywhere. I think about that guy way too often, more than I probably should, because it was just like I did that interview before you and I chatted,
right? And
I'm so thankful that I got to talk to him, then talk to you. I didn't necessarily think it was going to be as impactful having these conversations in that way, but I think about him often, because one of the most disturbing parts of my conversation with him, from my perspective, was that he kept bringing in slavery and other, you know, atrocities, you know, the Holocaust, all these other things that were comparatively uncomfortable for me. But maybe that's the point. So I would love to hear from you. Like, I've heard these comparisons a lot, not just from Matt, but from others. Is that something that you're comfortable with, using those comparisons to kind of to help people understand the worldview?
That's a really touchy topic, and I think so. So on the one hand, and just to echo what you're saying, I understand that there is a comparison. So let me back up a little bit. So first of all, globally speaking, about 70 to 100 billion animals are slaughtered a year annually for food and products, right? So in the entire history of the planet Earth, there have only existed 110 billion Homo sapiens in the past 250,000 years. So every year, 100 billion, say 70 to 100 billion sentient beings are slaughtered, mostly vastly and unnecessarily, because, well, whether or not it's required to have meat in your diet, or to the degree that people have it, those are different questions. So first of all, the numbers are staggering, and I don't think that most people, hunter or non-hunter, most people think, like pigs and cows and chickens, and now with a lot of scientific data, fish and a lot of fowl, they feel pain, right? So it's not a question. It's not a question about the physiology of these beings. So you have 70 to 100 billion sentient beings are slaughtered every year. So that's massive. You can't even wrap your mind around the number of animals that are killed for food. So if you have 70 to 100 billion sentient beings that are, for the most part, for a vast majority of them, they're unnecessarily suffering and unnecessarily killed, that's a moral atrocity. It's a moral atrocity. So it's something to say, holy Toledo, what the hell are we doing? How have we gotten to this point where we have this industrial, this system, this systemic suffering at such a high level? So that, putting that in those terms, it really is stark. It's startling. And it should cause people to stop and think. Now, on the other hand, there has been a long history of people, for example, African Americans or Africans all over the world, and with regard to the Holocaust, Jews and Gypsies and other subaltern populations who have been compared in a derogatory way with animals, right? So there's this ugly history of African Americans, of Asians, of Jews, right? And so to compare, to say, what we do to pigs is similar, just like what slave owners did to slaves. There's a sensitivity. You can't ignore the history, and for people, there are African Americans and other minority groups who look at things like that PETA does and says, like, how can you do this kind of comparison? It's really it's totally insensitive to the history, and for that I agree, and I feel like that is something that's important. But what I want to say is it's a fine line. I don't think that no comparisons can be made. I think it's important to do it in a particular context. It's important for historically oppressed peoples to recognize that there are similarities between the ways that non-human animals have been treated, are being treated, and oppressed groups, but also on the part of animal rights folk to just sort of like willy-nilly go like, this is just like the Holocaust, or this is just like slavery. That to me that's really being insensitive. And the last thing, if I can say, is that the reason why, and going back to our conversation earlier about the issue of speciesism and saying, look, humans are supreme, we reign supreme, and we're just better for all these reasons. That's part of the reason. The way that speciesism and human supremacy are just embedded in human culture, that can account for the reason why when someone calls you a dog or a pig, like the fact that that's even a derogatory term speaks to the way these ideas of speciesism and human supremacy are just embedded in like human culture. So even going back to the question of like, why do people compare oppressed groups to animals in a way to lower their moral value? And that is, like, why do we do that to animals in the first place? So it's a very complicated, relationship. But I do agree with you and I don't know Matt personally, but whenever I see animal rights people sort of just nonchalantly saying this is like the Holocaust, my response, I feel like, you know what? I don't think that's not helping the movement. That's the average person is going to go, what the hell? Why are you? So it's very problematic. But again, I just want to go on the record as saying, I do think that it's legitimate to make certain comparisons, but the way that it's done has to be done thoughtfully and sensitively.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because that's the one thing that I wish I had said to Matt and would say to other animal rights folks. It's like, I understand. I think I understand the point you're trying to make, is that we as a human species have inflicted lots of unnecessary pain on each other and on the world, on the environment, on the world around us. Just as the very nature of our existence, we are an imperfect organism. We just kind of consume and consume and consume. We've inflicted a lot of death for reasons that now don't seem justified. So I get it in making that point that, history. If history is our guide, we know that we've made some really terrible decisions as just us, and so I get that. But then it just seems like a logical parachute, and really also a way of intimidation, a way to make people uncomfortable and kind of scare them a little bit into kind of adopting this belief, or at least semantically adopting this belief, which, if you really want to create a movement, having a bunch of people that are kind of intimidated and coerced into stepping into it under like, well, maybe this is slavery and maybe I don't understand it. It just felt to me like every time we would kind of get into a point where we got into a sticky piece of the conversation, Matt and then other folks in the animal rights movement that I've talked to kind of used this as a way to just, let's pull the parachute and let's push this into a corner and kind of keep it in the frame that I need to keep it in. And so I just like you, I think I understand it in the way that it's trying to frame the conversation. I get it. And I do. And I always said, I think I may have said in our conversation or in the conversation, Matt, I'm not one that's going to say we've been doing it for millions of years, so we got to keep doing it. That's not in my playbook. I don't think that's ever that, we can learn from history, but we're not going to just continue to justify all these things. So that's one that just bothered me personally, and I've been trying to work through it and understand it, and I just keep seeing it pop up. So I appreciate the way that you certainly take it on and move to it. But one thing you said a little bit ago that I had written down that I kind of wanted to discuss and at least get your point of view. When I've read a couple of different studies and surveys that upwards of 60% or more of vegans, specifically vegans, are eating that diet or practicing that lifestyle based on an ideology rather than the nutrition of it. My good friend Joe Rogan had a bunch of uproar around James Wilkes' documentary on Netflix called Game Changers, and then he had Chris Kresher on, who is a nutritionist that was kind of refuting some of the nutrition elements of this. And I just sent Joe a text that said, hey man, that's fine. The nutritional part of this is fine, and I think we will continue to debate that, but let's not forget about just the ideological draw here of veganism. Is that something that you found in your teachings and in your own community, that it's that 60-40 split of I'm here to inflict less suffering and I'm here to be healthier?
Yeah, I know what, I don't know. This is all anecdotal. I think that veganism recently has increased mostly due to questions of health and sort of like plant-based, having a plant-based diet as opposed to having a moral or ethical diet. So it seems in recent years, just like as I said, just my observations, it seems like a lot of people who identify as vegan are doing so for health reasons, or maybe just because it's a trend, trendy kind of thing. When you say ideology, I do want to. Ideology can be a loaded term, and I've heard ideology used as, and I'm not saying you are doing this, the term ideology can be like a signal to, I think a better way for me to think about it is having like a moral or ethical stance relative to your diet and things like that with regard to veganism. So are there a bunch of people? I think here's what I found is the whole connection between the environmental impact, and this is something you and I talked about before, and we agree, right? The environmental impact of agribusiness, of massive animal food production is, I mean, it's one of the largest producers of greenhouse gas. So there's a lot of people who are like, hey, as an environmentalist, I'm going to adopt this plant-based lifestyle. And then there are people who are, like, I want to be healthier. I think the number of people who do it for a political or an ethical reasons as a standpoint, I think that's probably the lowest percent. Maybe it's 40%, maybe it's 25%. So I do notice that there is this. I mean, look, veganism, at least for now, in the culture, relative to how it was 10 years ago, it's exploding. I know that. I remember when I first became vegan years ago, if I went into a restaurant and said, like, is this thing vegan? People would say, what are you talking about? Now it's like, at least in California, right? And, I've been around the country in New York and Philadelphia. Like, I can go into a restaurant and say, is this vegan? People actually know what the hell I'm talking about. So there is a movement, but I think it does have to do mostly with environmental concerns or health concerns. But, and please don't get me started on your buddy Joe Rogan. I think, Joe, he obviously has an axe to grind, and I mean, we all have certain axe to grind, but I'm not a nutritionist, but I do think that there are plenty of people on the planet who are physical living manifestations of who have physical health, who do not consume animal products. So, and I can't get into like, this person said this and that nutrition. As you can imagine, you can find a nutritionist who will say you should only eat celery, and you should find people that say so. Hey,
amen, because that's exactly what brings it up. But yeah, hey, to this point, the point of that podcast I mentioned, Joe was like, yeah, I mean, James Wilkes. He had Chris Kresher on to crush James Wilkes' Game Changers documentary, and then James Wilkes came on and just completely flipped the script and dominated the conversation and changed Joe's mind.
Well, that's good to hear, because I didn't hear about the Wilkes appearance, but I saw the other Kresher appearance.
Yeah.
And
so Wilkes just basically walked in the door and kicked the shit out of Kresher and made him look like a fool. So for me, that's even more. I just don't. I feel like even in this conversation, I would, like you said, I think. And I'm glad you said it. I think you could find a nutritionist to say just about anything, because it's such an exploratory world.
Yeah.
And so when I'm listening to that, I'm like, yes, I get all this, and heme iron and B12. I want to understand those, and I want to make sure that our audience understands them. But at really at the heart of a lot of this is, the point that I think you and I can discuss is just the death and suffering part and the morality part. Because I think whether it's 60% or 40 or 20 or 10, it certainly, I think, underlies many vegans' thought processes, and also it should underlie, and it has to underlie, many hunters' thought processes. And so I think I'd like to I wanted to just lay that out to say that, like, we could certainly both go get 20 different papers, whether it's epidemiology or, data-driven studies, and present our cases to each other and try to back up what we believe the best diet is. But it's cultural, it's societal. I mean, there's so many impacts on health and what we intake that in that way, I think, I'm not sure if you would agree with this point, I think that if you were to look at, big ag in its whole, large-scale agriculture, whether it's animals or plants, all of it has imperfections. Whether when you're looking at, and this is not my intention to kind of go down either of these roads too deeply, because I want to get to kind of the death and suffering part, but there certainly is, large-scale agriculture is is degrading our soil and causing runoff, and then we've already documented large-scale animal agriculture is bad for the environment for numerous reasons. It's also bad for the animals if you care at all about their welfare. So I think maybe if we could pause there for a moment and kind of get your comment on, feeding people out on a large scale, almost by its nature certainly degrades our earth.
No question. I mean, we have 7.5 billion people. By the end of the century, we're going to have 9 billion people. If everyone on the planet Earth were to have the kind of lifestyle that we have for the most part in the United States, it would require, I don't know how many Earths, 4 or 5 Earths, to produce those kinds of resources. So having the carrying capacity of this little blue ball is just not up to 9 billion people that we're going to have. And so we have this kind of dilemma, and there's an intersection of many things, like the animal suffering aspect, the environmental impact, the feeding of humans, keeping humans healthy and viable. So these are really gigantic, big problems. With regard to producing food for people, I mean, one of the arguments that vegans have at the ready is to say, look, the amount of, and anytime I give a talk on veganism, I usually get the question, well, if we did away with animal agriculture, then we can't. How are we going to feed people? Like, how are we going to have all these people being fed? But the fact of the matter is that most of the grains that are produced in soy and things like that go to feed animals anyway to produce meat. So as far as lowering the impact on a massive scale of the environmental degradation of the planet is, a quote plant-based diet definitely has on its side that aspect that it's less harmful to the environment. But the point you're raising is, as I mentioned before, in the United States, I mean, the number is about 40 billion chickens. It's about 40 billion. In the United States, it's 9 billion chickens. It's about a few billion pigs and cows. So there's massive suffering going on just at the animal concern, just fully with or solely with animal suffering. So how can we have a diet, putting aside for the moment the environment, how can we have a diet that has a low suffering or a lower suffering impact? And this is where I think, for me, veganism is it contributes to decreasing the suffering. And there's some studies recently done. There's a really great paper that came out last year looking at the supply chains of like supermarkets. Because for a long time, people said, if people go vegan, that doesn't really make a difference. There's no causal efficacy from the consumer to the production of animals. But that actually, it turns out the supply chains, they have this stuff so dialed in that when you go to your supermarket, it doesn't take a hell of a lot of people to change their diets to actually impact the animal production side. So I think that's it really does. As a vegan, you really can make a difference in decreasing animal suffering. And I know you, Ben, and people like you who are hunters. I mean, part of my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're not a big fan of like going to the supermarket and buying a steak and wrapped in plastic and taking it home, right? I mean,
I would never do it. If I just went a year without killing an animal, I would begrudgingly borrow wild meat from my friends. My wife and I have arguments about this all the time. I say, like, you do not, for any reason, and she always pushes me like, well, I'd love to have some lunch meat. What are you going to do about that?
Right.
So we have a little bit of an adversarial relationship around like, hey, we can't just eat all elk all year, idiot. Like, we have to have some varied meats, like white meats and different things. It's just not palatable for our family. So we do have of that. But yeah, that point really, I think, goes to like where we agree. Like, it just I've had it since our conversation, actually, yours and mine last time, really inspired me to go down, and we've done this. I mean, we've talked about regenerative agriculture on this show. I've visited a ranch in Texas and got to see regenerative agriculture firsthand and learn about soil health and soil biology. We've had, other folks on the program that have started like local butchery co-ops where people are able to butcher their own animals and share the meat, and kind of everybody knows where the meat comes from. So all of this has kind of inspired me to understand more of the tangible, less the intangible. The idea that there is some diet, whether it's because the question I always ask is, veganism is better. Well, what form of veganism? Veganism comes in so many different forms, I'm sure. I don't practice it, but I know. And I know wild people that are hunters take part in the practice in many different forms. Some people kill one deer a year and just eat that deer and also buy steaks. Some people like me really abhor that factory farming and not knowing where my meat comes from, because, as we'll discuss here in a little bit, I kind of know what that death feels like, and I know what it is to look that in the eye, and I would never want to be a proxy for that anywhere else. So it's like those understandings lead me to kind of maybe a little bit of an animal rights perspective, maybe a little bit of it more over the vegan perspective of like, this is not sustainable on a large scale. And at the at the same time, large scale plant agriculture is in and of itself, even that practice is harmful as well, given the many variables in that as well. So I kind of just stop and say, I want to understand the tangible better. Who's starting a local farm? Who is backyard gardening and keeping bees in their backyard and having chickens? Who is doing what you said at the beginning, is becoming more self-sufficient in a more holistic fashion. And for me personally, and this is just me personally, hunting has brought me to that idea because it taught me what I could do and my own self-sufficiency. And it's kind of given me this aspiration to have a life that's holistic in that way. So, I mean, that's only my personal experience. And it's driven me to just say, like, what's the tangible rather than the intangible? Because I think all mass production and all the feeding of our eventually 7 to 9 billion people is going to be imperfect, and just by the nature of what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, yeah, Ben, I mean, here's what I wonder about when you raise the self-sufficiency. When I think about going back to our question, the population, and I respect, I mean, when you say something like, well, there's someone who could maybe shoot a deer and make that meat last for a year or however long. When you have, like I said, 7.5 billion people, maybe in 1900, the population was like 1.6, 1.7 billion people, right? So now we've exploded. So what I wonder when I think about the choices that folks like you, thoughtful hunters, have made, and think about self-sufficiency, I also think about the problems of scale. Like, can you have the lifestyle that, and each of us, like myself included, right? Like I'm a vegan, I'm living in a metropolitan area. You're a hunter, and you live in Montana, so it's a pretty it's not a non-affluent area. But for someone who takes the position that you take, can 7.5 billion people live like you live? Can 7.5 billion people go out and get all their hunting gear and do the entire thing, and the hundreds of how much thousands of dollars to get the equipment and do all that, and have freezers? And I mean, so that can't happen, right? So
they can't.
Yeah.
I would just say, I flatly, part of the reason why I want to talk on this show and just publicly about regenerative agriculture and all the other things that kind of lead to self-sufficiency is because that's not the case. At the same time, we've talked about lab-grown meats, and we've talked about large-scale animal agriculture on the show, because I know that it's a personal prescription on a relatively tiny scale. I mean, it's the number of hunts, like 9 to 11 million hunters in the U.S. I mean, that's such a tiny number. And so I just for point of the conversation, I kind of see it at this moment as a personal prescription that makes my life better. It is not a prescription for the health and well-being of our society, on a scale. It just isn't, can't be. It would lead to ruin of our wildlife resources and our land resources. So it sits in a weird vacuum, I would say.
Well, I think it's important, and I appreciate you acknowledging that. And of course you would, because you're very thoughtful and you've thought about all this stuff. I do hear people, and again, this is anecdotal, but just reading social media and reading the internet, people who are what you might call locavores, and sometimes I think, wow, these people haven't thought through, 7.5 billion people can't survive on heritage pork from Northern California, right? So
I love it. I love the point.
So this whole thing about this is like good for the planet. I mean, it's good for the planet for a small percentage of humans who have that privilege. So, when you acknowledge the way that you just did, right, to say like, hey, this is not scalable. I don't think that needs to be. Those kinds of realities need to, I think, sink in. And when I talk about people who are locavores and talking about heritage pork and stuff, I'd be willing to bet, I'm just guessing, Ben, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people like that probably are not into hunting and they're not into like guns, and like you probably find those people more on the hippie side, and they're more at least publicly, quote, planet friendly, maybe they're Prius, whatever. But that's what's interesting is like, they're sort of, I don't know if it's a willful ignorance of, wait a second, the kind of lifestyle that you're promoting, it's not scalable. So at least let's do what you just did, Ben, and say like, yeah, this is a preference for my own personal life, rather than act like this is a panacea and if everyone did this, the planet would be okay. It's impossible. Yeah.
So, as we talk about this, I think my major point to you, and I'd love to hear what you think about this idea, Robert, is shrinking the commentary. I feel like at least we can get our arms around that a little bit. And that's kind of what I've moved to after being so confounded by, how we feed all these people. A smaller, more prescriptive approach that's like, hey, where do you live? What do you do? What do you value? Let's try to make you more self-sufficient, improve your diet, improve your health based on the environment in which you've chosen to live or which you find yourself in. I think it's just, I would just acknowledge that this is such, the large-scale conversation is such a hard thing to maneuver. I've tried to kind of shrink it down just a little bit on my end.
I think that's an important component. Excuse me, but I do think so. That's an important component for anyone on the food consumption spectrum and lifestyle spectrum, hunter to vegan, I am big ag producer. That's certainly a part of it for me, but I do think for me and for probably a lot of ethical vegans, part of the issue is, as I mentioned last time we talked, this is a ethical or political issue. And so as much as I do want to, I want to do these things simultaneously, I would like to promote and come to understand with others the best ways that we can individually carve out a little lifestyle or way of being that decreases, the impact on the planet and on animal suffering. Meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier, if we have 70 to 100 billion sentient beings in this massive systemic industry that are suffering and being killed, that requires more than me siloing myself into my little vegan world, right? That requires a political action or some kind of social justice action. So I do want to say I don't want to to find fully the solution in we all just need to take care of ourselves. Meanwhile, there's this system that is really gone off the rails. It's basically an unsustainable system of producing animal meat. So I what I want to say is, while we're doing this, figuring out our own personal and our own little ways of doing things here in our lives, I need to remain engaged with the larger political aspects of animal rights and veganism that involve ending the suffering of tens of billions of animals, mostly just so that people can satisfy their palates or get fulfill these preferences.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot of that I agree with. I think the way a lot of hunting communities are set up really exactly does that as well. I mean, it says, conservation is kind of the tenet in which we live by, and that's health of ecosystems, that's health of wild populations. That's we live with like a larger ethos in mind. And one thing I would say, in discussing kind of our food production system, the system of animal agriculture, and kind of how we change that. I've discussed with several folks. There's one company called Force of Nature Meats. They sell captive cervid meat, which I don't agree with, but they also look at sourcing animal protein in a way that uses regenerative agriculture and is friendly to the land. And so as I look to those types of companies as possible solutions here, across the board, kind of divorcing the do we kill animals or not for a moment, as I look to that, the answer they often give me, people in that situation, is the consumer's lifestyle overall dictates what these industries do. So if people stop buying, factory farmed chicken, if the demand dries up, then everything else dries up with it. So I do think there is some connective tissue. While I understand kind of the proclivity to be more of an activist for the message, I certainly am in a lot of ways for hunting. There is this connective tissue between what you do and the lifestyle you promote in your own community, and then how that's married with, changing how these food systems work that we all, that you and I know agree are not palatable for many reasons.
And Ben, when there's something you said that triggered a thought in my memory is, for the many years I taught at Cal State Chico up in Northern California, which Chico is in Butte County, which is pretty much an ag community, right? There's a lot of ranchers. My students so I started an animal rights class in the philosophy department when I got to Chico, because there wasn't an animal rights class. And ironically, the class was chosen to be a part of a certain, what they call these pathways, like different themes that students can take. And one of the pathways is the food pathway. And so I envisioned my class as being like a social justice or a philosophy of justice class, and it got put into the food pathway. And one of the upshots of that is that in my classes, say of 45 students, I'd have 20 to 30 students who were ag students who were they were ranchers. They were fifth generation ranchers, right? And so, as you might imagine, a lot of interesting conversations ensued in that class. But this is a long about way of saying that oftentimes when these issues of consumer demand would come up in the industry, big ag, because a lot of my students, when they graduated, they went right into big ag, right? And so what they would say to me is, well, look, we're merely meeting consumer demand, right? That if consumers didn't demand this, if there wasn't a market demand for it, we would be out of business. And I think that that's a wonderful thing for a student to say who may be in an ag program, but I think you and I, hopefully you would agree that it's a little bit naive, right? It's a little more complicated than simply that consumers demand something and it's produced, right? We both know that demand can be generated through marketing and advertising and lifestyle. And so it's not a simple equation that, and I'm not saying you're saying this, I'm just saying it's a complex dynamic that says The meat industry, milk does a body good, gotten milk. I mean, all these, pork, the other white meat, beef, it's what's for dinner. The West wasn't won on salad. All these, the beef counts, all these ag lobbies, and I'm not saying people are, sheep, but I'm saying there's a certain aspect of generating demand through advertising and through marketing that is effective, right? So that has to be acknowledged too, that when we look, going back to our original point of thinking like, what can I do personally in my own life to alter the way that I behave and maybe act as an exemplar for a way of life that I think is more sustainable. And then looking at the bigger sort of political aspects and saying, yeah, but there's billions and billions of animals in the system that are suffering and dying unnecessarily. It's important. I don't want to fully like villainize the ag industry, but the ag industry is partially responsible for that the meat culture. It's not merely that people want to eat meat, and so when you're talking about these companies that say, when people's demand for meat decreases, one of the ways it'll decrease is if activists who are shedding a light, and not just vegans, just people who are from different walks of life who are shedding a light on the atrocity of what the ag industry, like you said, it's doing to the water tables, it's doing to the environment. So that's what I'm getting at, is the activism for me has to be built into the lifestyle choice. And that's why I see veganism not so much as a lifestyle or as an identity, but as a stance, like as a political stance to say, I want to decrease suffering in the world. When my day comes and I leave the planet, if there's something I could have done, even incrementally, to open people's eyes and say, this is an unsustainable system, and along the way, billions of animals are suffering and being killed unnecessarily, then I feel like, okay, well, maybe that's that's the best we can do. Not all of us can be Gandhi or, so we have to do what we can in our lives, but we can't ignore the system. Yeah. And I don't even want to open this door, Ben, but I'll just use a word.
Oh no, don't trigger me. Please.
Corporate capitalism. We've never even talked about corporate capitalism, and that's a whole other discussion. But, we do live in a system where, going back to our original discussion about the rickety system and not being prepared, and our government not being prepared, a lot of this, or at least a large part of it, has to do with things like profit, right? So when someone in the ag industry looks at the bottom line and says, I need every quarter to produce profit, I'm not sure that person is thinking 20 years down the road, 50 years down the road, how are we going to have a planet that's sustainable? When you're always pushed to think about quarterly profits, that's not I think you would agree, that's not a way to produce a sustainable planet by just looking at the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
O'Reilly Auto Parts are in the business of keeping your car on the road. O'Reilly Auto Parts offer friendly, helpful service and the parts knowledge you need for all your maintenance and repairs. If you're confused about what part you need, like what wipers are going to be the best, what replacement headlights are going to be the best, go into O'Reilly and talk to the people that work there, because they're great and they're super friendly, and they'll get you squared away where you walk out knowing you got the right thing. They've got thousands of parts and accessories in stock, either in-store or online, so you never have to worry if you're in a jam. Do you need your windshield wipers replaced? You need a brake light fixed? You need some quick service? They'll help you find the right part or point you to the nearest local repair shop for help. The professional parts people at O'Reilly Auto Parts are your one-stop shop for all things auto do-it-yourself, and you can find what you need in-store or online. Stop by O'Reilly Auto Parts today or visit us at O'ReillyAuto.com/MeatEater. That's O'ReillyAuto.com/MeatEater. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today. You ever get that feeling you're stuck inside staring at screens and a primal urge kicks in? You crave wide open spaces, fresh air, the chance to connect with the land. Well, maybe it's time to find your own piece of the wild, but searching for property can be a maze. That's where land.com comes in. They got millions of listings across the country, from mountain ranches to hidden fishing holes. Their search tools are like a seasoned guide helping you narrow down what you want. Land.com isn't just about buying and selling. It's about finding a place to hunt, fish, explore, or simply sit by a campfire and listen to the crickets. So head over to land.com today to turn one day into today, because trust me, there's nothing quite like the feeling of standing on your own piece of earth.
You know, the nuances of this are so many and so important. I try to think of a way how I'd like to kind of articulate what I want to get across here, because it's got a lot of these things have so many layers, which is why I appreciate, you know, kind of working through this stuff with you, because you start on one thing and then it just kind of unleashes all these other layers of logic. I guess in terms of the systems, I find that I have a particular immunity to these systems, and that immunity comes from this idea of self-sufficiency, right? So in terms of the marketing of meat or milk or whatever, if I'm able to build my own structure of health and well-being and fitness, both mental and physical fitness, and kind of like a life of my own that's sufficient, and I know kind of the cause and effect on a very local level, I'm then and I do this personally, I find myself a little bit immune to the bullshit in the mainstream media. Kind of, I can tell when a lobbyist group puts something together, because normally it's just a piece of pandering media. And so, yeah, I think maybe the worldview that it's crystallizing for me and hearing you talk is there's an idea for me that, you know, while we have this time to examine these larger issues, and a bit of that involves our own privilege as being affluent and in a certain part of our society, if you're able to build your life in such a way, and whatever elements you bring in is up for your own, you know, decisions and structure, is to say, hey, I'm immune to the marketing. Because I know where my meat comes from, so I don't care what you tell me. Or I'm immune to having to go to the store and buy eggs because I got a chicken out back that lays them, and I know when they're good and when they're not good. That kind of has a waterfall effect, and it has in my life to kind of go further and further and further to create those value systems in my own life. So if we could, I guess maybe where I disagree with you is like activism on a personal level, as long as we're promoting that activism by saying, build your own structures, share those structures with other people you think would benefit from them, get yourself away from these systems, whether it's food systems or all kind of our cultural structures that we know now that are weak and flawed and built on, like what you said, some of them are built on corporate greed, some of them are built too emotionally, and they don't have enough just hard facts built into them. But you can kind of build up an immunity to that stuff, and I have, and I feel really good about that. So I don't know where that fits in all that we've covered, but I think that's where I land on kind of the activism.
And I think it's important, Ben, to take that stance and to take that position where you can build immunity, and that requires critical thinking, that requires critical thought, that requires understanding the systems and the kind of worldview that you are advocating, which builds this kind of immunity. people need, especially in let's keep it to the the United States. That's a difficult, that's a tall order to get an entire nation of people to start thinking critically about these issues. And it's deadly important. Our survival depends on it. But and so like one of the I teach at a state college, a California State College, and I teach critical thinking. And I tell my students that this might be, a general education class, and you're taking this class, critical thinking. What the hell is critical thinking? But what I tell them, in all sincerity, is that critical thinking is the key. In many ways, it's the key to liberating yourself. It's a key to liberation, to be able to build what you're calling this immunity, because. And there is a certain luxury to it, right? There's people who are like, a lot of people, there's 500,000 people who are homeless in the United States. I got to go up to a homeless guy and say, what the hell are you eating? And why? So there are a lot of people who aren't in the position that you and I are, to have the luxury or the privilege to understand and build this kind of critical thought and build this immunity. But that said, right, it's a worthwhile goal. It's a worthy goal to say one of the things that's going to save us, if anything's going to save us, is having this kind of critical thought that you're talking about. And when I look at and the thing, I don't know if this happens to you, Ben, but it's like I'm so immersed in the way that I see advertising, or the way that I see food promotion, or lifestyle promotion, or clothing promotion, or car promotion, whatever. And I have this view, and I sometimes forget, like, this isn't the way most people think, right? And these ads and these kinds of lifestyle presentations and these television programs, they actually have a lot of impact on people. So it's like a wake-up call sometimes. I'm like, wait a second, I'm sitting here teaching critical thinking. I'm thinking critically about food production, about animal suffering, about capitalism and corporate greed. And I kind of get lost, and I have to check myself and go, wait a second. This is not how everyone thinks. This is not how the masses think.
Yeah.
And so part of the solution, it's funny because we've talked about this before the last time. It's like there's a certain sense in which you and I, our worldviews or our life choices, they're in opposition. But I think, and we've talked about it before, like if you pan out and get a global picture, people like you and I are actually we're much more in accordance. We made different choices, like we've talked about, but talking about critical thinking and immunity to these kinds of pressures, I think we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean,
hunters like you and vegans like me actually share a lot.
Yeah, I like I said, I always go back to that analogy because I feel like we share so much, and we've been trained kind of within our communities, and even outside of our communities, that we're not the same. That we do have these worldviews that can't coincide with each other, and that there is this adversarial relationship, and I just don't believe that. And to your point about kind of like what is the masses. That's one of those things, just kind of like the nutrition of an all vegan diet or all meat diet or whatever you might say. You can find a lot of examples either way. I've heard a lot of guys like Sam Harris and Eric Weinstein and a lot of really impactful intellectuals talk about this kind of like, is there a mainstream, or are we just being fooled in that there is one? There's a lot of kind of the democracy of podcasts is a good example of millions of people listening to something that is outside of the structure of, and this podcast is a good example of that, outside of the structure of what mainstream quote unquote media is. It's not the Tonight Show, it's not the local news, it's not, you and I aren't talking heads on a TV screen arguing for 30-second clips. This isn't a presidential debate where we just hit sound bites and whoever wins has the best sound bite. And it's not social media where people are playing an arcade game to score points in some strange social experiment. This is kind of a divergent from those mainstream examples. And podcasts are huge. Joe Rogan's being like the biggest podcast in the world, and he talks about all kinds of crazy shit, whether you agree with some of it or not. So I wonder. This is an open wondering of mine. I'm not saying the mainstream is. Let's give it more credit, but I just wonder how we define those things and how much credit we should give ourselves. Because I do think that lots and lots of people are in kind of the unaddressed majority. Well, the unaddressed portion that want to think critically, but just don't know where to go because mainstream media has told them that they don't want to think critically, and they'd much rather just be pandered to. So I at least we can open up the door and say, like, walk through or don't, but this isn't mainstream. It's not going to be structured like all these other things.
No, great point, Ben. I don't disagree at all. I think it's that provides like a check on my cynicism to think, oh, wait a second, there is a democratization of information that can have a positive effect, and that's partly what I do in my critical thinking classes. Is I have 45 students sitting there for 15 weeks, and my students don't know that I'm a vegan. They don't really know much about me. I don't use that as a platform for my political views. What I tell my students is, when you walk in the door in August and you walk out in December, if you have the same beliefs you had when you walked in the door, that's not a failure to me. What's a failure to me is if you haven't examined why you have those beliefs. That the purpose of the critical thinking is to examine your beliefs and why you hold them, not to change them necessarily. I mean, of course they will change, but so I do. I mean, you give me hope to say, well, there is this non mainstream democratization through these kinds of media that can spread these ideas. And okay, good. Thanks, Ben. I feel like it's a little better.
Virtual hug. I know I couldn't hug you in real life, but a virtual hug, buddy.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. I'm with you.
We're okay. I do think that. And I think it's strange that this conversation comes to those points, but it's true. It really does. It really does denote that we can, you and I in this conversation, and we as the plural, like the plurality of everyone that cares about what they're eating and doesn't fall into these societal traps. Like, we can be together on this, even if we're being told we're not. We can. And there's hope in that, and there's like a lot of us thrive on this, adversarial conversation. I do not. I couldn't. Sometimes even if I disagree with something you might say or someone else, I just move past that because I want to get to a conversation where we can kind of examine not the positive motions, but the kind of more constructive things that'll move us in one direction. So that's just always how I approach it. But I do want to, before we go or end this, I've been really drawn to, over the last, say, 3 or 4 months, reading about and thinking about death and suffering. And it's really dark to say. Now that I say it out loud, it's like, oh, that's real dark. You spend your free time doing that, do you? But I do in some way. I believe, and we talked about this last time, I believe that my proximity to the death helps me to understand and appreciate what death is. And I guess I'll say it this way, I wouldn't want to remove myself from the death, knowing that it's being caused by my consumption at some level, no matter what. I want to find a way to understand it. Like, for example, if I would remove kind of the hunting piece for a moment, I want to plant a garden in my backyard. We have an infestation of voles back in my backyard, and these things are destructive. Mm-hmm. And so I have a choice now. Like, do I let them have a piece of my garden, or do I kill them? Because I'm not going to transplant them or translocate them somewhere else. So I kind of have this real life, like life and death thing to work out. Most people, 99% of people that I know, would just kill the voles. They don't. They're not a beautiful animal. They don't have much value. They're rodents. They live underground. We never see them. Dead. See ya. But I thought about it, and still I'm thinking about it. I haven't killed a single one of them. And I think my train of thought around that is 100% due to my hunting. Because I see death, I know death, I appreciate death in a way that's very constructive and also very dark. And I have what some philosophers call kind of like tragic wisdom, the wisdom of the moral ambiguity of death and life and how there just is no certainty. So I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm interested just to kind of hear, because animal rights is so much about reducing suffering, hear your thoughts on both my backyard conundrum and how you approach death.
Yeah, and I think, and Ben, my hat's off to you that you haven't, your knee-jerk reaction wasn't to just decimate the vole population in your backyard. I think, like you said, most people would just figure that's the solution, right? Get rid of them.
Yeah.
I do want to disagree. I think voles are actually kind of cute, but that's just my own aesthetic. But I think when it comes to there's separate issues of death and suffering, right? So to like disentangle those concepts, the experience of these sentient beings, like a vole or like a pig or something, or like a deer. So while they're alive, their lives can be, there can be a point of suffering reached where just the life just isn't worth living, right? If you've ever euthanized a beloved companion animal or something, right? It's like, it's just not, the suffering is too great. And so I think there's the question of the suffering, and then there's the question of the death. And so the issue for me with regard to veganism and animal rights is this notion of unnecessary suffering. And the reason I talk about unnecessary, or I mention unnecessary suffering, is because some suffering is necessary, right? Like if you have you have kids, if you get them, you take them to the doctor and they have to get an injection or some vaccine, whatever, and you think, well, there's going to be transient suffering for a moment, but then it's going to have a greater good. So that would be an example, of course, of like a necessary suffering to achieve a greater good. The question of unnecessary suffering is like, it doesn't really serve a purpose that warrants the suffering that's occurring. Like, for example, I don't think that my desire for a bacon donut warrants the suffering of a pig in a factory farm, right? So the suffering aspect of the sentient being, for me, is something that I want to seek to reduce, because I think it's uncontroversial, right? It's like unnecessary suffering is a bad thing, and as a caring human being, as a person who cares about other beings, I want to reduce that. So to your vole question, I've had issues when I lived in a house a few years ago. I had rats in my attic, and I was like, okay, so I don't want rats in the attic. I don't know I don't have anything against rats personally. I know that they're sort of, they're seen as vermin. Vermin it's a relative term, right? Like in some parts of Africa, chimpanzees are seen as vermin, right? Whereas we would say, oh, chimpanzees are beautiful beings. So my point is, I was like, okay, what am I going to do with these rats? I don't know if they have disease. And so I did some investigation, and I could have just thrown the glue trap up there, but instead I found these little cages, and I read all about it, and I stuck the cage traps up there, and then I quickly caught the rats in the trap, and I drove them out to some mountain region it was like a half hour from my now I did all this not thinking that now the rats are free. Like, as far as I know, I could have opened the cage and a coyote could have eaten the rat like a minute later. So I wasn't like, I didn't have this idea that like I'm liberating the rat to be free and happy, but I just didn't want to kill the rat. And I thought, I'm going to give the rat a running chance. And I caught 3 rats actually in my attic, and I let them go up in the mountains, and that was it. So I felt like as an individual, I didn't want to contribute to that particular case of suffering. But now, we've talked about this before. It's like, I have to have my eyes open, and we are all caught in this cycle and this system of suffering and the system of killing and the system of death. And so as a vegan, I want to say on your podcast, as a hunter's, podcast, it's important to recognize that all of my choices are attached in some way to some suffering and some death. Whether or not it's choosing to eat vegetables that cause the deaths of insects when they're harvested, or small field animals, or in some way. So I really appreciate the fact that you feel compelled to address up close and personal the issue of death, because my fear is that most people, but I'm going to focus just on vegans, that vegans might remove themselves or think that they're removing themselves. Yeah. In the same way that the person who goes to the supermarket and buys the plastic covered piece of steak and that's removed and it's sort of sanitized, there might be a tendency for vegans to think, well, now I'm, like I said, I'm a little bit more pure, but in fact, there's death all the way down. When you take the trail far enough, you're going to find some kind of death. So I really respect the fact that you and people who think like you see coming to grips with death and the death of the animal for your sustenance as an important component in who you are, as your character as a person. That's really important. So I think I don't ignore the death aspect, and I do think it's important to think about our consumption with regard to the death that it causes. And as a vegan, I want to say I cause death too in my purchase. I drive a car. When I get home from a long trip and there's hundreds of insects on the front of what am I doing as a vegan? How far do I take this, right? And so I think veganism, and if you look at the original notion of veganism as when it was coined back in the 40s, the idea of veganism is to the best of our abilities within reason to reduce suffering and reduce death. And so I think it's important for vegans to not dilute. We shouldn't dilute ourselves and have more experiences like you're doing with your own life in confronting death. Now, whether or not I want to go, and again, we haven't really talked about this with regard to our life's choices, but then there's something about. There's something about like the person who goes into the supermarket and buys the steak, and they can be divorced from the suffering and the death. And there's something really inauthentic about that someone like you who gets an animal in his sight and pulls the trigger and ends the animal's life and interacts with the body and the viscera and all that, that's an important thing. And by that said, what I want to say, and this is a topic for another discussion, is how can I say this? As a person, as a striving to be a thoughtful person who doesn't want to inflict pain and suffering, I don't know if I could pull the trigger. Like the act of. There's one thing if I buy some tofu and that caused the death of a field animal, and maybe Ben, like maybe I've heard some hunters say like, people like you're just more heroic because you're like the Nietzschean Superman. Like I face death and I look it in the face and I'm not hiding behind any kind of facade. This is what it takes to survive, is to kill. And what I want to say is there's a certain sense in which I say my hat's off to you because you have bridged that existential moment of an embraced killing. However, I want to say I don't know if I want to be that kind of person. Not that I don't want to be inauthentic, but I don't know if I can do what you do. I don't know as a vegan, as someone who values, has my possess the values I do. Man, there's something about pulling the trigger, and it's not to say like I'm weak, because as we talked about in the last podcast, I actually, as a teenager, I have killed animals with a gun. So it's not about weakness, or it's not about authenticity for me, and it's not about like machismo. It's just about, man, like it might be necessary to do it. I just don't know if I can do it. Just like there are some things that might be necessary to, like, some people are like, look, I had to euthanize this human being because of this, it was a choice. It was like a Sophie's choice, and I had to choose. And I guess I want to say is, man, I don't know if I want to do that. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm both praising your decision, but I'm also calling into question what it's like. I'm not passing I don't want to pass a judgment. What I want to say is that's a certain decision to be a kind of person that I just feel so like atavistically I feel so uncomfortable with that. So I don't know you've thought a lot about this. What's your take on that?
Man, it's so, like I said, I have to just like take a step back and think how I want to structure what I'm about to say, because it does have so many layers, and it impacts in such different ways. I guess I'll start by saying that act of killing, and I've said, and Michael Pollan wrote this in his book, An Omnivore's Dilemma, like, hunting looks so different from an outside perspective than it does from an inside perspective, and for good reason. I mean, just like you said, we are being raised, and we're coming up in a society now. It's not our fault. It's just when we were born, that is full of all these proxy activities where you go, I buy clothes. I don't make those clothes. I don't know how they get here. I don't know what, I know they look nice, and my wife thinks I look cute, but I don't know much about it. So I'm choosing like, hey, look, I know intellectually that it's not a perfect process how these clothes came onto my back that I'm wearing right now. And I know at some point I'm just this being that doesn't understand that I'm just collecting things inside of a home, and I'm just collecting all these things, and I don't understand why I'm doing it. I'm progressing in a certain direction. I don't understand why I want more things, and why that's supposed to make me happy. So there's just a lot of like the being built into that. So I want to, within addressing what you're saying, is just to say, like, I wouldn't continue to do it if it didn't provide immense value to my life. And what I would say to, not you personally, because your approach is so even-handed, to other people that don't like what I do, I wouldn't keep doing it if I didn't feel like it had immense value to my life, because I don't like death. I'm not a sadist. I'm doing it because of the overwhelming value that it brings. It also, that value has baggage that comes along with it. And I address that baggage, and I am choosing to explore pathways to make that not baggage, to really make it an additive to my life and this activity. So that's how I would kind of address that part of it. To your point of, hey, I just don't think I can do this. I think that's okay. I think that is a reflection of all of the conditioning of where you've lived, how you've grown up, the values that you have seen that we share and don't share. So I think there's certain of us that can do it. The point I'll make over and above that is I've had a lot of people that were in your position and we do this a lot at Meat Eater overall. We take new hunters out, we show them our value systems, we show them the way we approach it. I have never, not once, and I can tell you it's only my anecdotal like 12 or 15 people I've taken out as new hunters. I have never once had somebody do the thing they were so scared of and that they thought they couldn't do and come out of it with the same level of kind of abhorrence that they went into it with. I'm not saying that proves my point. I'm just saying that's my experience. And I'm sure if I just took them out and been like, shoot that deer, and they shot that deer and it fell over, I'm like, all right, let's move on to the next one. They would maintain that abhorrence. So killing is a practice that like requires an insulation of ethics and morality and discussion. That does make it different if you approach it with a single-minded, like, I'm going to kill this thing and eat it, or I love the game theory of matching wits with an animal. I think it requires all those layers. And then I guess the third part of this, which goes back to my vole analogy, I think I'm just aware of the series of bargains I have to make to move through this. And particularly to that bargain, and I thought about this the other night. I was a couple of whiskeys deep, but I thought about, if I let the moles live, I probably can't, because these things are going to propagate and they're going to be just destroy my yard. I'm not going to be able to have the garden that I want to have if I let these things live. And if I kill them, I'll have a garden. Well, if I let them live, I have to go buy my vegetables elsewhere and enact a proxy I wouldn't have had to do if I had a garden in my backyard. And so I might let these things live and there might be no suffering on their part, but then I have to go and kind of enact some mysterious suffering through buying vegetables from a local farmer or going to the grocery store or whatever. So I would much rather kill the number of voles as necessary to grow my garden and have control over that part of it. So I think that the constant bargaining is something that I hope, if vegans listen to this, I don't know why they would, but if somebody who's a vegan listens to this, like, don't, and hunters too, don't act like you're not bargaining everything that you do. Like, and I like that your approach is to just think about the suffering. Is it necessary? Is it unnecessary? I think about it that way too. It's never perfect on any end of it. So I think that's something I would love for people to take away from this. Is like, we always are making bargains, and I'm choosing, I know we talked about this last time, I'm choosing the suffering I can see and control versus the suffering I can't see and can't control. Both through my hunting, and then that kind of gets reflected through the rest of my life.
And I greatly respect that. And I think, the issue of confronting the suffering, I think that's important in all aspects of our lives. With regard to what you mentioned earlier, I mean, there's the suffering component with regard to food production. There's a suffering component with regard to dry goods and clothing. There's a suffering production, suffering footprint with, where we choose to build homes and where we choose to live. And like I said, there's 500,000 homeless people. I do homeless work. When I was in Chico, I worked with a homeless organization. And I think there's an analogy here is, I spent every Sunday when I was in Chico, every Sunday in the plaza where the homeless population often gathered, and we would, our little group, we would talk to them and, hand out some clothing and stuff. But the main focus of our interactions were to get up close and personal with the lives of these human beings and find out, like, well, how did you get here? And what's going on? Tell me about your life. And of course, in the town, the majority of people, there was a big movement, to remove the homeless and criminalize, right? And what I would say in my presentations before the city council or in my letters to the editor would be like, look, come out to the plaza, come out and talk to the people and humanize them. They're here, and the notion that you have that this is a scourge that needs to be removed, I bet you once you spend an afternoon talking to someone and humanizing them, you'll feel differently. And so what I'm getting at is that, you and I, like, we've both chosen this path of, like, to be aware of the suffering engaged in our food consumption. But as you mentioned as well, there's suffering all over the many chains of our interactions in our culture, in our lives, in our society. And I think it's really important, Ben, this point you bring up, it's really important for us to confront the suffering, to look closely at the suffering, and as my good buddy in homeless work in Chico, Patrick Newman, always says, he says, in that suffering, in that death, there is invaluable information to gain, to tell us about ourselves, to tell us about who we are as a people, who we are as a culture. So when you, and for you and people who hunt, like who we are as interacting with animals, and what does it tell us about, animals and their sentient lives. So I think this is a massive, important point that you raise is, and again, we can't spend every minute of our lives looking at all the different sufferings. It would take up all of our time. But by the same token, we don't want to bury our heads in the sand and shield ourselves from these realities, right? So I really do. I think you make such an important and profound point. Is that confronting the suffering and confronting the death, as difficult as it is, it tells us about ourselves. It gives us information about who we are individually, who we are in our families, who we are in our communities. And I'm with you, man. I advocate more confronting the suffering. It's what it's going to do, as difficult as it is, and I know you agree, it's going to make us better. We're going to be better on the other side of that examination.
Yeah, I think exactly. And if you, that's why I come back to, we had a Cornell ethicist on, Dr. James Tantillo, in January, and we talked about this idea of tragic wisdom, and and whether or not hunting is some sort of serious art, and it is, and it starts to bring to bear, and it has brought to bear in me, and hopefully people that listen to this show, what you just said. Can we take this baggage? Death is never going to be a positive. Suffering is never going to be a positive. It's always it's the baggage of life. It is, to live is to suffer from, suffer from death, and at some level. And so if we can just acknowledge that and say, that's where hunting becomes kind of a ritual experience to me, in a way that, and I would tell you that one of the main rituals I've come to appreciate. I'm 34, so I can't say in my later years, like in my 30s. What I've come to appreciate in this time of my life is kind of the transformation of this animal that lives and breathes and suffers and has relationships and has natural knowledge and has been created out of thin air. This is like just a ball of it is in itself just kind of morality. I take its life. I feel what I feel. Sometimes I feel more than I do other times. It's just kind of, it's just a very ambiguous thing to explain. But once I get through that part and I start to take its hide off, I start to examine the parts of its body that I want to eat. I take those parts, I deconstruct those parts, and then by the time it gets to where I'm getting ready to cook it, the transformation in my mind is so complete that it goes from this thing I struggled with to this ultimately beneficial thing. And to ride along with that from the struggle to the benefit is where the value sits for me ultimately. And so I would say to all vegans, I don't want you to go shoot a bunch of animals, but find something that gets you there, that gets you from the struggle to it. And it could be your clothes. You could go, make your own clothes and understand the struggle to get the textiles and get the knowledge and understand the abilities you need to have, and then finally make a shirt that's comfortable and doesn't feel like shit. Like that, the struggle, the suffering, all of it. If you can find something in your life that tracks that journey, you'd have to be completely impervious to not find some perspective from it.
Amen, Ben.
So yeah, that's where I sit, and I think, that's where I think you're doing the same thing, man. You wouldn't be a vegan or animal rights person if it didn't provide value to your life, you're not doing it to make a point. I know you're not. You're doing it because it's you feel it's making your existence better and wholly beneficial.
Yeah, and like I said, even if it's just a little incremental difference when my day comes and I'm like, well, I was on the planet for X amount of years and I left the place maybe just a little bit better than how it was when I got here, just because something I did. That's really what I'm looking to do is to really just reduce the suffering. As you said, it's never a good thing, but I try to fight feeling powerless as an individual. And a lot of the things we talked about today, I think, are in the realm of like, what can we do as individuals? And, in my darker moments, I do think, can I make any difference in this entire system? But on the days when I feel good, like we were talking about before, I feel like, let me put it to you this way. Even if I can't make a difference, I still have to try. Like it's almost like there's no choice. As the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said back in the 40s, he's like, the French, we're not fighting fascism because we think we're going to win. We're fighting fascism because it's fascist. It's fascism, right? And I feel like I have to do what I have to do, and it's really it's not really for the results anyway. It's just because I have no alternative. I have to try to live a life where I to the best of my ability, live as authentically as possible, confront the death and suffering, and maybe, I don't know if I'm lucky, maybe make the place a little bit better for my kid.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the point you made earlier on is an important one. Like, we can do both. We can shape our own personal, impact, but then also worry about how are we going to solve this problem overall? Because we can impact our governments in the way that they're constructed, and our global society and the way that we treat each other and what we value. We can impact that by speaking out and talking about it too. So I appreciate it, man, and you really do. Like, just talking with you. I don't know if this is the case for you. Like, you bring out a lot in me that I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. So I appreciate it, man. I think it's
feelings likewise, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I thank you for that, man. It's I love doing podcasts for this reason, because you come off like, hey, who knows what we figured out, but we at least are able to talk through some things that I probably wouldn't have without your presence. So I really, really do appreciate that.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it a lot.
All right, well, you're going to come back, aren't you? This will probably spin into many other conversations here down the road.
As long as I'm breathing, I'm ready to go on with you, man.
I love it, man. We'll be safe, be happy and healthy over there, and we'll check in soon. Thank you.
Okay, Ben. Take care, man. Bye.
See ya. That's it. That's all. Another episode of the books. Thank you very much to Robert C. Jones for joining us once again. I can't wait to have him back the next time. As I said there at the end of the show, and even in the opening, he, I think, brings out the best in me. He makes me think critically about very important ideas, and I'm happy to have him around for that reason, and others. He's just a really nice guy, really thoughtful guy. When this is all over, hopefully we can share a whiskey and talk about these topics in even more depth. So hang on for that. All right, well, we'll see you next week. We had a great one for you next week. That is with Donnie Vincent, the great and powerful Donnie Vincent. Had a good conversation with him about his views on the pandemic and his views on nature and viruses. So stick around for that. It's an entertaining one. We'll see you next Tuesday on the Hunting Collective. Say bye, Phil.
See ya.
You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins. After 3 years of work, our follow-up to the Meat Eater Fish and Game Cookbook is here. It's the Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, campfire, and camp stove. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside, from grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Get your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com or buy it wherever books are sold.